Welcome to Climate Change and Health in Small Island Developing States focused on the Caribbean. If you require translation into Spanish or French, please use the link posted in the chat and choose your desired language at the bottom of the Zoom screen. You should continue to keep this browser open as well to utilize the chat and Q&A features. Please be sure to scroll down and hit mute on the video. Please use the Q&A feature to submit any questions for the panelists. This session is being recorded. Thank you.
Good afternoon, colleagues, participants, fellow scientists, friends. Welcome to the third session of the Climate Change and Health in Small Island Developing States. Focus on the Caribbean. This afternoon's session is entitled, the third session, Developing Climate Resilient Agriculture for Better Health. We have three presenters this afternoon. The first presenter will be Luis Vasquez, who's from Cuba. Luis has more than 40 years of experience in research and innovation in agriculture, initially focusing on pest management and biodiversity on farms. He has spent the last 25 years focusing mainly on agroecology and farm redesign, and more recently, studying traditional farming systems, design and resilience to climate change. He is currently advising on several projects for the agroecological transformation for resilient farms. The second presenter will be Mr. Christian Fleming. He's a climate change and development specialist at the Caribbean Agricultural Research and Development Institute. Christian has been employed at the Caribbean Agricultural Research and Development Institute as a climate change and development specialist since September 2016. He works at the intersection of climate change and rural livelihoods. He is particularly interested in interdisciplinary and participatory methods and approaches to confronting complex issues resulting from both the biophysical impacts of climate change and the socioeconomic environment in which people exist. Currently, Christian is involved in research seeking to answer questions of how best to design, deliver, and utilize climate information services to support decision-making and innovation among farming communities. Our third presenter is Steve Maxney. Steve is the Managing Director, Science-Based Initiatives. He will be talking about Caribbean agriculture, One Health in an Era of Climate Change. Steve Maxney has successfully completed assignments in the health, food, environment, tourism, and agricultural sectors. A plant pathologist by initial training, his first regional consultancy was with PAO in St. Kitts, Nevis in 1981. An EU-recognized senior expert in climate change and agriculture, he has worked in every CARICOM country. Here we have the three presenters, short bio. The first presenter will be Luis Vasquez, who will give you talking on the topic Design Climatic Resilient Farms, Experiences in Cuba. Over to you, Luis.
Hola a todos y todas, mi nombre es Luis Vázquez, trabajo como investigador asociado en el programa de agroecología de la UNTAF, una ONG del sistema de agricultura. En este evento, con mucho gusto, compartiré con ustedes nuestros avances en innovaciones que realizamos con agricultores y agricultoras en sus fincas para identificar los mejores diseños agroecológicos para la resiliencia ante el cambio climático. En primer lugar, es importante entender que para la adaptación y mitigación de la producción agropecuaria ante el cambio climático es apropiado el enfoque de resiliencia socioecológica. Y para esto, la agroecología provee las bases científicas y metodológicas. Para transformar estos sistemas en resilientes, la base está, en primer lugar, en la integración agricultura-ganadería, la diversificación de las producciones, los diseños complejos de los sistemas como policultivos, agrosilvopastoreo, otros, la integración de las estructuras de vegetación auxiliar, como secas vivas, etc., y una estructura espacial y altitudinal de la matriz con cierta complejidad. Todos estos cambios, como veremos más adelante, se pueden realizar y estos pueden ser más eficientes en la capacidad de resiliencia de la finca a partir de criterios de las funciones que se logran con estos diseños. Entonces, precisamente, nuestros estudios que son realizados principalmente con los propios agricultores y agricultoras en sus fincas en distintos territorios del país, tuvimos una primera etapa de entender la vulnerabilidad de los principales tipos de sistemas de producción en la agricultura. También evaluar junto con los agricultores y agricultoras la sensibilidad de los componentes de producción en las fincas y ambos criterios como base para hacer estudios de fincas, estudios de capacidad de resiliencia de fincas, principalmente a sequía, aunque también más recientemente a ciclones, huracanes. Con estos trabajos, el objetivo fundamental ha sido cómo rediseñar la finca para buscar capacidades de resiliencia y sobre estos aspectos traemos aquí los avances en la identificación de las funciones de resiliencia para el rediseño de las fincas. La vulnerabilidad de los principales tipos de sistemas de producción agrícola del país es de más del 60%, en este caso sequía, es más del 60%, y esa vulnerabilidad de más del 60% es para casi todos los sistemas, excepto los sistemas agroforestales de café y de montaña. Para ciclones tropicales, más del 50% de vulnerabilidad a estos tipos de eventos, con menor vulnerabilidad para los sistemas de ganadería convencional. Como ustedes podrán apreciar, estos estudios que fueron realizados en 11 territorios agrícolas con participación de técnicos, agricultores, en base a sus experiencias, nos permiten tener una idea de que la mayoría de los tipos de sistemas de producción, estamos hablando de organopónicos, huertos intensivos, fincas campesinas, fincas convencionales, ganadería convencional, agroforestería. La mayoría de estos tipos de sistemas de producción son vulnerables en más de un 50 o 60% a los principales tipos de eventos que ocurren, que es, como decíamos anteriormente, la sequía y los eventos hidrometeorológicos, principalmente ciclones, huracanes. Como parte de la vulnerabilidad, hicimos saber la sensibilidad de los componentes de producción porque son los que deciden la producción agropecuaria, valga la redundancia. En este caso, valoramos suelo, cultivo en crecimiento, cultivo en cosecha, riego y control de plagas. Observen que para la sequía, los niveles más altos de sensibilidad están en el suelo, el cultivo en crecimiento, el riego y el sistema de control de plagas, y menos el cultivo en cosecha. Y para ciclones tropicales está un poco compartido la sensibilidad entre media y alta del suelo, alta y a media del cultivo en crecimiento, por supuesto, y alta media al cultivo en cosecha, que son los dos componentes que más se afectan ante la incidencia de ciclones tropicales. Esto para tener una idea de que la vulnerabilidad en general de los sistemas y en particular la sensibilidad de los componentes de producción son elementos importantes para poder estudiar y buscar las características que se necesitan para la resiliencia. Y en este sentido hacemos énfasis en la importancia del componente de producción porque es donde se puede medir la sensibilidad a los efectos físicos de estos tipos de eventos. El estudio de la capacidad de resiliencia de fincas a la sequía, que se muestra aquí para 3 fincas suburbanas en La Habana, muestra que las fincas, las 3 son fincas en transición agroecológica. Sin embargo, como se puede ver en la parte inferior del gráfico, hay diferencias en la capacidad de resiliencia a pesar de que las 3 están realizando o adoptando la agroecología. Esto quiere decir que la transición agroecológica es convergente con la capacidad de resiliencia a sequía y con respecto a los componentes de resiliencia, la resistencia, absorción y la transformabilidad son los componentes que tienen los mejores valores en estas fincas estudiadas. Esto como evidencia, ¿no? También estudiamos resiliencia de fincas sequía de 20 fincas, a sequía en la zona semiárida de Guantánamo, y efectivamente las fincas todas son fincas campesinas y presentan diversidad de capacidad de resiliencia ante sequía, algunas más altas que otras, y las fincas precisamente las que mejor capacidad de resiliencia tienen es porque integran cultivos agrícolas y frutales. Sus superficies menor de 8 hectáreas, predominan los campesinos que son tradicionales y mujeres que administran la finca. Esto es un poco la característica de estas fincas. En el caso de los ciclones tropicales, donde es un poco más factible hablar de tolerancia, aunque también se puede hablar de resistencia, depende mucho de las características biofísicas de los tejidos, de la estructura de la planta y de cómo se realiza el diseño y manejo de los sistemas de cultivo, principalmente las buenas prácticas agrícolas. A partir de estos estudios hemos identificado un grupo de funciones, le llamamos funciones de resiliencia porque son las funciones que se deben lograr con las prácticas, o sea, con los diseños y manejos que se realicen para que el sistema adquiera capacidades de resiliencia. Esas funciones de resiliencia para ciclones tropicales hemos identificado 4 funciones: amortiguar efectos físicos de vientos y rachas y sus rachas, amortiguar los efectos de la lluvia, reducir efectos de corrientes de agua cuando hay exceso de agua y reducir encharcamiento e inundación. Esas son las 4 funciones que hemos identificado. Para sequía, las funciones son favorecer mayor humedad relativa, favorecer retención de humedad en el suelo, reducir radiaciones solares directas sobre el suelo, reducir radiaciones solares directas sobre el cultivo y reducir la exposición de animales a radiaciones solares directas. Insisto, estas son las funciones de resiliencia, o lo que le llamamos funciones de resiliencia, porque deben ser logradas en el diseño de los sistemas. Estos estudios, por supuesto, continúan. No obstante, tenemos algunas conclusiones que queremos compartir en este momento. Primero, que la resiliencia a sequía excede el hecho de disponer una mayor cantidad de agua para las plantas y los animales productivos, porque se requiere de un microclima que atenúe sus efectos, optimice el uso de agua y reduzca el gasto energético por evapotranspiración, todo lo cual es posible mediante el rediseño multifuncional de las fincas. Y la biodiversidad, en especial la biota productiva y la vegetación auxiliar, juegan el rol principal en la capacidad de resiliencia de fincas, siempre que el rediseño se realice considerando los caracteres funcionales que aportan las especies y su ubicación espacial, temporal y estructural. Muchísimas gracias y esperamos que les haya sido de utilidad.
Thank you. Thank you, Luis, for a very crisp presentation and demonstrating the use of agroecology techniques to mitigate against climate change and establish resiliency in the farming systems. In the interest of time, I won't go into any more summations of your presentation. I will call on Christian Fleming to make his presentation entitled Climate Smart Agriculture, which is a very broad topic.
Good afternoon, colleagues, and all those who are interested on the topic. I know many of us share this concern. Thank you for the organizers for giving us this opportunity to share our perspective on climate smart agriculture, and especially its intersection with health goals across the region. If I were to paint a picture of the Caribbean food system, which is really linked to the global food system, is one that can be characterized as a high consumption of diets that are based on ultra-processed foods, high levels of sugar, sodium, and trans fats. Several studies have shown that there's an inadequate amount of consumption of micronutrients, and there's particular concern over the consumption of calcium, folate, thiamine, and other micronutrients found in food. Populations across the region, I think, fall short. Again, we see in literature that there's a falling short of the recommended daily intake of fruits and vegetables. And together, these things paint a perfect profile for countries that has high rates of overweight and obesity, leading to a host of non-communicable diseases, as we see in the region. When we look at the production side of the food system, as was painted before, we have a very vulnerable agricultural sector. The sensitivity and the exposure of agriculture in the region to climate impact is unprecedented. Hurricanes, droughts, and floods is of particular concern, and it is very normal almost to have these events traversing through the region annually and causing devastation and loss and damage to the agricultural sector. I don't want to go through, for the sake of time, go through all these stats, but just to show that oftentimes at the passing of one of these events, especially hurricanes, there's damage to the sector close to US million of dollars in one event sometimes. And in many cases, there are recurring events or two events back to back facing some countries. There's also a concern that tend to be quite doesn't receive a lot of attention, as with what we see from the climate, and that is a reliance on a high reliance on inputs. Many of these that are imported into the Caribbean and are facilitated by very long and complex supply chains. When you're thinking about, for example, agrochemicals and seeds are one of the two areas that there tend to be a lot of reliance on, significant reliance on imports. So while we have a production system that is vulnerable to the climate, we also have a production system that in many ways are very vulnerable to other stresses, especially when it has to do with the supply of these inputs. And in today's world, especially, we are seeing that many of these supply chains are very fragile and in some cases are on the brink of collapse, as we see reports around the world. And if I zero in on the use of agrochemicals, for example, there's concerns over the pesticide residue and human health. We need to ask questions about the sustainability of the use of agrochemicals, especially in instances where a number of these aren't used properly or efficiently. And I already mentioned the issue about supply chains. I think together, the picture that I painted on nutrition, as well as the vulnerability of the production subsector in the region, together really demands and calls for a repositioning of our production system, and especially one that is based on resilience. And when we are thinking about sustainability, also nutrition. There are two things I want to highlight for the sake of time that we at CARDI and wider have been paying more attention to. One of these have already been highlighted. And the first one is the use of climate information. Agricultural production depends on the climate, and our production, whether it's crop or animal husbandry, these really depend on the climate. We have a region that is primarily rain-fed, agricultural system that is primarily rain-fed. It is an asset to have climate knowledge. And that's especially since what we knew traditionally and typically about the climate isn't necessarily the case today. The traditional experience as to the onset and offset, and even the variability of these of the climate isn't necessarily the same as we knew it before. So climate information across various timescales, whether short-term or long-term, I think there's a need for this sort of information to be integrated into our production, into our production planning and the decision making that we make, especially when it comes to adaptation and enhancing resilience. Climate models, together with that, also paints a broader picture as we look into the future to really get a glimpse of what are potential scenarios for the climate in the future, and how that relates to what we are practicing today. With that, I just want to highlight some of the work that we are doing in this area. Here we have an agroclimatic bulletin that we believe is a one important tool in the arsenal of climate smart agriculture for the region to help guide our decision making, not just at the farm level, but right up to policy, research, and investment. This product is a cooperation between the Caribbean Agriculture Research and Development Institute as well as CIMH, the Caribbean Institute for Meteorology and Hydrology. And the aim here is really to give both a review of past climate information conditions, as well as an outlook into what we can expect in the upcoming season, all with an effort to guiding the measures, both operational, what can be done on the farm, but in many cases, tactical and strategic decisions that one might need to make in order to have a secured livelihood in the upcoming season, depending on the projections. Another example that has been introduced into the region is PICSA, or Integrated Climate Services, using a participatory approach. And the uniqueness of this approach is that it utilizes historical, locally available historical information. Many times, farmers would, stress that there isn't relevance a lot of times for climate services, and that's really, when you get behind that, is really an idea, the idea that a lot of the data, a lot of the information isn't relevant to their scale. PICSA is one that utilizes the micro scale, looks at the farmer's context, giving them the opportunity to enhance their understanding of the local climate, and together with other tools, come up with appropriate adaptation and resilience building strategies. But I want to get to the second area, which I believe where we can find a lot of synergies with our efforts to become resilient, to also pay more attention to the aspect of health, and especially from a nutritional perspective. In the region, our landscape is comprised of diverse plant and animal species. And we know that these things contribute to our rich biodiversity. And from a biodiversity standpoint, one can argue that a lot of our local and regional genetic resources have adapted to diseases, pests, and changes of the climate over time. Some of these things that I mentioned before. We believe that more attention needs to be paid towards what is locally available and culturally appropriate, and a lot of times that are nutrient rich or biodiversity, because it does have a role for combating the nutritional insecurities that we see in the region. There's a potential to significantly reduce our dependence on agrochemicals, and also to reduce environmental pollution and food contamination risk. Much of our genetic diversity is neglected and underutilized in agriculture, and this isn't solely for the region. This tends to be the reality across the world. Again, us at CADI have been, some of the work that we've been doing in this area is identifying and conserving, also evaluating some of these varieties, looking at their performance alongside various climate stresses, improving access and availability of these to farmers, as well as ensuring that there are conservation strategies at multiple levels and multiple different forms. But some other areas that we believe that are pertinent to climate smart agriculture focus in the Caribbean is the use of protected agriculture or controlled environment agriculture that gives us some, offers some ability to, withstand and perform under harsh conditions that we typically face annually. There's a role for us to pay more attention to utilizing what I presented before, more of our locally and culturally appropriate resources and their wild relatives within our value chains that show promising signs for this.
Christian, you're running over time. Can you wrap up now?
Thank you, Greg. And I just want to end by indicating that I think there's implication here for research and policy, and I would end on that note. Thank you very much, and apologies for being over time.
Thank you, Christian. I think you did a very good presentation, and the two critical areas you highlighted, the use of data information and climate model information for our production systems, and the use of improved varieties from the point of view of being drought tolerant and nutrient enriched. Our next presenter will be Mr. Stephen Maxney, who will be talking on the subject Caribbean agriculture and One Health in an era of climate change. Over to you, Steve.
Thank you, Greg. Thank you, colleagues. I've been asked to speak on Caribbean agriculture and One Health in an era of climate change. Next, please. I've set myself 3 objectives: to briefly cycle through the overlapping phases of CARICOM-wide agricultural efforts, to examine agriculture's nexus with human health, and to suggest possible areas for further intersectoral research. Next. In describing these overlapping phases of CARICOM-wide agricultural efforts, it started primarily around the 60s and 70s when we were, as a Caribbean region, I'm speaking specifically about the Anglophone Caribbean now, we were looking at increased productivity. There was this perception, a very real perception, that we were involved in subsistence agriculture and we needed to be more productive. There were a lot of technologies coming out of the Green Revolution that impacted on us. And we got into a rapid phase of agrochemical usage. I mean, to the extent where we saw the yield increases that were promised because the seed material, just as Christian was saying earlier, we had a technology that was foreign-based. We had imported seed, imported agricultural chemicals. And with that proliferation of agrochemical use, it wasn't long before we got into concerns about agricultural health and food safety. Some of the pioneering work we did out of the University of the West Indies in St. Augustine with people like Dr. Rohit Doon, who was then a chief official in the Ministry of Health in Trinidad. We started looking at the impact of these pesticides, these agrochemicals. I mean, we went through the full gamut. I mean, I'm old enough to remember the days when we were using methyl bromide and Dow fume and so to sterilize soils, and thereby probably sterilizing people as well. So that era morphed into the food safety era, when we were really, really concerned about, not just increasing productivity, but producing safe food and safe from contaminants of one form or the other. And I must mention the pioneering work of people like Dr. Webb, Dr. Lloyd Webb, who really introduced me to the whole concept of One Health. And having gotten the food safety aspects fairly decently correct, we then found ourselves into another overlapping area. Now that we are producing efficiently, hopefully, and safely, we now have to be concerned about the environment. And we see now that in this era of climate change, we have to now incorporate environmental sustainability into it. Next. So most countries are attempting to implement a comprehensive CSA, climate smart agriculture. And I'm stressing on the comprehensive part of it. Ideally, this is meant to improve food security, and I've underlined some of these, and agricultural productivity, increase the resilience of farming systems to climate change by adaptation, whilst capturing potential mitigation co-benefits. Next. Now, health as defined by the World Health Organization is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease. And this is important for the points I'm attempting to raise next. Next. One Health recognizes the interconnections between soil health in terms of the type of nutrients that end up in the food. I mean, Christian spent some time talking about the lack of nutritional fortitude, if you like, in some of the food that we're producing. This whole question of microbiome, I'm going to bring that up when I go to my final slide. But in terms of plant health, the nutrients, some of those micronutrients that we have been stressing on, the contaminants that you find. In terms of animal health, the interconnections between animal health and human health. I mean, we know about the prevalence of zoonoses. I mean, the Caribbean region has been well served by institutions like RIPAHA, and so that provided us with paraveterinary services. We had a very active system of veterinary and public health. And I dare say we had to include in that plant health as well, because in the whole vista of One Health and what is now being fashionably termed planetary health, it was seen, the interconnections were seen. I mean, as a plant pathologist, I remember having access to agromycin. I mean, why would you want to be using agromycin in field applications without the implications for bacterial control in human health? So that nexus with human health there involved nutrition, infection, infestation, because the food that we are producing, some of the agricultural products were infected, infested. There was, of course, the whole aspect of human well-being. And I want to come to that in terms of this new vista of planetary health. Next. So this agricultural health nexus involves nutrition. It's a triple platform from my point of view. We're looking at nutrition in terms of how do you build proper immune systems, really, very topical now in this era, in this COVID-19 era. Everybody is talking about biological botanicals and nutraceuticals. How do we reduce some of these non-communicable diseases, which I'm going to spend some time on later. Nutrition in terms of growth, for energy, for repair, for rejuvenation, for recuperation. So that agricultural health nexus was always, I shouldn't say always, but was fairly firmly established in terms of nutrition. When we got to food safety, as I mentioned, the work done in the 70s and 80s and so, and even now with CAFSA, we recognize, okay, yes, there's a food safety nexus in terms of reduced infection, reduced infestation, reduced injury. But what we have often neglected is not just food safety at the farm level, but food safety throughout the loop value chains. And with this new circular economy, we have to be concerned about the looped value chain and food safety in terms of not only production side issues. And I want to just stick a pin here and those of you who were not with us yesterday, Dr. Hospedales explained that he was recovering from a bout of leptospirosis. And in this new era of climate change and climate smart agriculture and a return to organics and this perception that most people have that the pile of rubbish in their backyard is compost. Whereas if you forget yourself and add
Steve, you're running over time, huh?
Meat scraps, yeah, sorry. Meat scraps, and so then you realize that you're really misplaced. So next. So areas for further intersectoral research. Investigations on the links between soil and gut microbiomes under differing climate smart agriculture operations, food safety in terms of bioaccumulation and One Health, and the syndemic implications of non-communicable diseases and the nationally determined contributions, which I hope we will have some time to discuss in the question and answer. Next. Thank you, colleagues. Thank you, Greg.
Thank you very much, Steve. I think you highlighted something that most of us do not pay attention to, and that is we need to focus on soil health, plant health, animal health, and human health. We need to get those four right for sustainability and for our production systems to be resilient over time in this climate change environment. We go straight into the question and answer sessions. And there are a few questions in the chat, so I'll scroll along the chart and begin to put the comments and questions to the panel. The first question I see is, how can we promote the use of more indigenous foods and crops? And they gave a couple examples here, peach palm and piwa, which was a staple for the indigenous people in Central America in pre-Columbian times. But I think the general question is how can we use more local indigenous foods? And I'll probably start with Kirsten on that quickly. How can we use more indigenous foods in our production systems and for health consumption?
I think one of the key things that we can raise a lot of awareness about them. I think one of the things that is often missing is some of the benefits of these things. And I believe that's one way we can promote its use. And for us, research organizations, that presents some implication for us that, we need to spend some time perhaps pulling out, the properties and benefits of these things. So that's one I could come up with for the sake of time. There are more.
Okay. Steve, you have anything you want to add to that?
Just to say that we have already started, behind most of these climate smart agriculture activities are indigenous crops and indigenous germplasm. As Christian mentioned earlier, germplasm connections and heirloom varieties are going to feature a lot more prominently in this era.
I think just to support that, the root crops and tuber crops are an area where we can really use the indigenous varieties that are also disease resistant and in some instances drought tolerant. Luis, I hope somebody's translating, but do you have anything to add? No. All right. So I'll scroll down to the next question. How do we promote climate resilient agriculture in light of a growing population and a subsequent demand for infrastructural development throughout the Caribbean?
Well, if I may jump in, they're not mutually exclusive. I mean, I think one is a precursor to the other. A truly comprehensive climate smart agriculture or climate resilient agriculture or climate responsive agriculture, whatever acronym you want to use, they all basically have the same premise. You want to be able to adapt and mitigate. And any mechanism that incorporates that will automatically get you towards a more secure infrastructural development. I'm going to put into the chat some of the other opportunities to explore some of these things that we may not have within the 30-minute confine of this current discussion.
I'll go to the next question and I'll put this one to Christian. Please give one or two concrete examples of how biodiversity / genetic diversity can increase resilience. It's a very good question.
Yeah. Well, you touched on one already, Greg, the use of more roots and tuber crops. These, for just their characteristics, tend to be more resilient to a number of the threats or vulnerabilities that the sector face. They are below ground crops, so that alone offers them some resilience. But in a lot of ways, they tend to be also offer a lot of tolerance, for example, to drought and some diseases. The other example I could think about is as we pay more attention to these, our local biodiversity and genetic diversity, we ensure that they're utilized. We use them, and by using them, and especially conserving them, we ensure that they exist and will be around for a long time. And we don't want a situation where our diversity or biodiversity is shrinking because we are not using them.
But I think I can just add to that in the sense that a lot of our indigenous material disappeared when we introduced commercial varieties. And therefore, the tissue culture facilities, the gene banks we have around the region are supposed to store these indigenous material and commercially multiply them up for the farm system. Let me scroll down again and see what I see. Next question: which crops, vegetables like wet weather for when we have rainy, wet years and periods? In other words, we keep talking about drought, but are there crops that are more adept to wet conditions?
Yeah, watercress.
Anybody has a suggestion? I can make a suggestion. Dasheen, or taro as it's called, is a notorious staple used in primarily Dominica, Jamaica, St. Vincent, St. Lucia, some of the islands, Guyana, but it is one of the crops that can thrive in moist conditions, and it requires that for productivity. So that is one of the commodities, and dasheen is a very highly nutritious food, comparable with sweet potato, high in potassium, magnesium, and also it can be one of the staples for some of the islands. Any additional comments on that?
That's my answer, Greg.
All right.
Luis, did you have a comment from Luis?
I think Luis needs some translation.
I don't understand all, more or less. I understand more or less.
Okay. Next question, comment. Please differentiate between climate and weather. Say how you design farms to become resilient to a cosmic event like climate change, not in mechanical components, but in terms of quantum nature of interconnectivity and entanglements that arise.
Yeah. I don't know that I got all of that, but I get the sense in which differentiating between us becoming more resilient to what might be a long-term and a future thing in the minds of many, and what we face today, the realities of today. And again, I don't think they're mutually exclusive. If we are becoming more resilient, I think of part of our resilience building and adaptation need to be, yes, today for what the realities that we are facing today, whether being more short-term, what we see outside, and we can look at that and see the change that has taken place over time, as well as for what has been projected for the future, the climate, and changes that in the climate as we know it. Both of them, I think, require planning. Both of them require that we ensure that, as Steve mentioned, that there are multiple aspects that we incorporate, so that there isn't any, unintended consequences or maladaptations, things that we get locked into here and now. So I can't give examples off the top of my head. I don't know, Steve, if you have anything.
I'm really more concerned about the health implications of all the stuff we're discussing here. I mean, in this seminar, the focus is on agriculture and that nexus with health, and some of these changes that we are planning to make or have made have health implications. So by saying that you want to plant in flood-prone areas, let's say, there are health implications there. I mean, we all know what happens if you attempt to buy vegetables and so harvested during a flood, right? Or just after a flood. So I would be more interested in those aspects in terms of how many people still use conducive fluid, how many people still know that you can dip your vegetables in potassium permanganate, and how do you avoid H. pylori and those kinds of issues. I'm more concerned about that in a seminar like this, where you're looking at the health implications of some of the things we are doing in the agricultural sector. Right?
Yeah.
I want to make a comment here on health, because I probably, we who are focused on agriculture, don't place enough emphasis on human health. But from the wanton use of chemicals in the field, improper use of chemicals in the field, how the chemicals interact with the actual plant tissue, how they interact with the soil, the runoff. I want some comments on that, because the practices, if we use, for example, glyphosate, has been banned in some islands, but there's no replacement. And what has happened is the wanton use of other herbicides. So if you can give some feedback to our audience on the kind of practices which are not necessarily good agricultural practices, and how they impact on the environment and human health.
Well, sorry, if I can start, my interpretation of comprehensive climate smart agriculture, and as I said, I'll try to put a link in the chat. We have ascribed safety as being a major concern of any kind of climate smart agricultural activity. So it comes to safety in terms of the use of chemicals, agrochemicals, or even the use of organic material. Because as I mentioned, Dr. Hospedales, had a bout of leptospirosis. I mean, Greg, I don't know if you remember how tragically we lost Ricky in Dominica to leptospirosis. I don't think those of us in the agricultural sector fully appreciate that nexus with health in terms of our activities, our practices, whether we decide to go through the field barefooted. I mean, these are not the days of ringworms and so, but I mean, there are still other things that you're exposing yourself to if you do not recognize that nexus between health and agricultural practices. So that's the type of thing that really concerns me. Agrochemical use in soil. I mean, the soil microbiome, we now know that soil microbiome is almost mimicked by gut microbiome, and those things concern me.
We probably have one more minute, but I just want to add something to this health, human health aspect of it in agriculture. There's the physical health part, which we don't seem to be paying attention to, but we have to give attention to this, and I think that's a gap. The physical health of the farmer, the kind of tools he uses, the kind of sprayers, and lack of automation. It's not only impacting on the use of the chemicals and fertilizers and so, but
you're getting into occupational health and safety now.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that would of course have to be another 30-minute discussion.
Yeah, my watch says 3:51.
Yeah.
So we're supposed to stop at 3:50.
Yep.
So I will call this session to a close. Let me thank the presenters for very intuitive presentations, thought-provoking presentations. The participants, if you have any more questions, you can send them to the hosts and the organizers, and they'll be answered by the presenters. Let me thank the organizers for inviting us to present and for me to moderate in this session. Thank you very much, and thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.